From a sunny Nairobi. I hope you're well wherever you are. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our very distinguished panelists and all those people who have come from different parts of the globe to be with us. Thank you very much for making the time to be here with us to listen to the voices of 4 incredibly strong women from Kenya to Peru to Australia to Finland. We are going to hear about from these women who for many years and decades have been fighting for the rights of the indigenous people and women and advocating for rights to justice and fairness and equality. So welcome once again. On our panel today, we'll have Ms. Anne Durgam from Finland, from the Sami people in Finland. We'll have Sandra Creamer from Australia. We have Lucy Mulenkei from Kenya and Tarsila Rivera Shea from Peru. But before we go very far, I would like to also introduce very quickly the people behind the scenes. We have a whole group of people moderating your questions. We expect that you're going to have questions and comments to make, which you'll put on the chat, the YouTube chat. And we have a team of moderators. That is Jasmine, we have Wangoi, we have Maya, we have Leila, we have Conrad and Ernest. And now, from behind the scenes, we will be curating your questions and then passing them on to us. In addition to that, we also have today, because of our participant from Peru, we also have somebody who will be translating any questions in Spanish into English and then passing it on to us. Behind the scene, we also have Ali, who's our technical person and who should be able to troubleshoot. And then we also have Karoro, who is live streaming from Japan. And I am Sheila Wamahio. I will be your facilitator for today. And with me, I have Declan Magero. Declan, you want to put on your camera for a minute so they can see your face? That's Declan, who will be co-facilitating this webinar with me. Thank you so much. Declan, you want to take us through very quickly with the guidelines?
Thank you, Dr. Sheila. It's a great pleasure to be part of the moderator team. And we have a couple of guidelines that we recommend adherence to, especially for the participants, so that we have a smooth webinar session. So firstly, we request everyone to refrain from making comments that do not relate to the topic or to what is being discussed by the panelists. Secondly, the chat that can also be used to ask, the chat section can also be used to ask technical questions. For example, if you're having issues with sound, please feel free to raise whatever question it is. You can also direct a technical question to hello@jaslika.com. Thirdly, you can still write your questions throughout the presentations. Your questions will be compiled and passed on to the speaker at question time. The other guidance is we encourage questions from all our viewers. Though the webinar will be in English, any Spanish speaker wanting to ask a question, please do so on the chat, and we'll have it translated into English by Dr. Aguida and presented to the panelists. Where possible, we'll request the panelists to respond in both English and Spanish. When asking a question, please tell us where you're joining us from, your city, country, and your work or institution of affiliation, if any. Because an institution is guided by values of respect and diversity, any inappropriate comments will not be tolerated. If you make an inappropriate comment, you will immediately be removed from the chat by our team of moderators. Inappropriate comments include, but not limited to, personal insults, comments that are tribalist, racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ageist, or ableist. We are also reminding you that the webinar is being recorded. So with those very clear guidelines, we'd like to wish the panelists and all the viewers a great experience. Back to you, Dr. Sheila. I think your mic is...
Okay, thank you so much, Declan, for giving us those guidelines. Once again, for those of you who are joining us now, I'd like to welcome you and just start by saying that what we are going to discuss today is a very, very important topic. There are almost 500 million indigenous peoples who live in 90 countries in the world, scattered all over the world. 500 million, that's a lot of people. But they are disproportionately affected by poverty. The lifespans in general are shorter than other people by 20 years, lower. And excluded from access to natural resources, basic services, the formal economy and justice, as well as their participation in decision-making. Consequently, they're more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and natural hazards, including COVID-19 that we're facing now. The indigenous women and girls face triple discrimination and disadvantage on the basis of the gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And I think with that, I would like to introduce somebody who has been an activist and an advocate and a politician for indigenous people, and that is, she will be talking to us about justice for girls and indigenous girls and women. She is Ann Nurgam. Ann is a Finnish Sami politician, member of the Sami Parliament of Finland since the year 2000. She has also chaired the Sami Council. Ann has been a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues since June 10th, 2016, where she represents the Arctic Indigenous, the Sami and the Inuit. She was elected in its 18th session to chair the forum, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples' Issues, since 22nd April 2019. Welcome, Anne. You have about 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you, Sheila. Dear Indigenous sisters and brothers, and dear participants, it is an honor for me to speak in this panel because the rights of Indigenous women and girls are very dear to me and to the all Indigenous women, Indigenous people in general. And we strive to work to improve the rights. And first I'm going to introduce the Permanent Forum, and then speak a little bit about the Agenda 2030, and then address the Indigenous women and girls, and then have some conclusions for this panel. Indigenous women have been, for the long part of the Indigenous peoples, as well as the women's rights movement at national and international levels. The interface between the Indigenous women's movement and the international women's movement has varied through the years. In recent years, there have been greater linkages and synergies between movements with their own differentiated identities and agendas. Indigenous women are also raising their voices to advocate for the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Indigenous peoples' issues are now an integral part of major global agendas, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in particular with respect to issues of climate change, the environment, and human rights. However, this has not been translated into real gains for Indigenous women, who continue to face discrimination and marginalization on the basis of ethnicity, race, and socioeconomic status. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, an expert body of the Economic and Social Council, with the mandate to raise awareness and provide expert advice on Indigenous issues to the Council and through the Council to the UN system at large. Permanent Forum continues to play a key role in addressing the situation of Indigenous women and making recommendations thereon. First, it has strategically positioned the rights of Indigenous women as a priority at its annual sessions, either as a special theme or as one of the substantive areas, and has advocated through its recommendations concrete action to include their rights and perspectives in major intergovernmental frameworks. Second, it has created a global platform for Indigenous women to share experiences and difficulties and exchange ideas and strategies to achieve these goals. Third, it provides an institutional venue for Indigenous women to establish networks with non-governmental organizations and United Nations system entities to respond to some of the challenges that they continue to face around the world. In response to Indigenous women's concerns, the Permanent Forum over the years has adapted a large number of recommendations containing direct references to the situations of Indigenous women in connection with a wide range of issues, including education, culture, health, human rights, environment and development, conflict and political participation. In addition, each year the Permanent Forum has a standalone agenda item devoted to Indigenous women's issues. Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women, as well as the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, took an active role in the consultation and negotiation processes that led to the adoption of 2030 Agenda. And that 2030 Agenda contains 6 specific references to Indigenous peoples, 3 in the political declaration, 2 in the targets under Sustainable Development Goals 2 on zero hunger, which is target 2.3, and 4 on education, and 1 in the follow-up review section, in which the states expressed their commitment to engage with Indigenous peoples in the implementation of the goals and were encouraged to conduct regular and inclusive reviews of progress in achieving them, including at national level to draw up the contributions of Indigenous peoples in those reviews. The Permanent Forum has been providing input and analysis for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, working in close cooperation with Indigenous peoples major group. It has also included in its annual session a standing agenda item on 2030 Agenda in order to gather input and suggestions on better integrating the rights of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women into the processes at the global, regional, and country levels. And the next, I address Indigenous women and girls and environment. Issues of environment, sustainable development, biodiversity, and climate change involve a wide range of rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the basic right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. Indigenous women and men are crucial agents of change to combat climate change. Their unique and different perspectives complement one another. Indigenous women play a role in the Indigenous people's stewardship of their lands, territories, and resources, as well as their interaction with nature and practice of sustainable resource management and biodiversity protection. Indigenous women also play a critical role in food security in the Indigenous people's subsistence economy, as they are the main food producers. For these reasons, Indigenous women are most likely to experience the first and worst effects of climate change globally. Thus, they are often found on the front lines of resistance campaigns, defending their lands, their rights, and the health of the environment. For Indigenous peoples, their lands, territories, and resources are the source of livelihood, medicine, intellectual property, food security, and spiritual well-being. Land is not only a factor of production. For Indigenous women, this also signifies Mother Earth, life dignity, the basis for their culture, spirituality, beliefs, their survival, food system, and traditional medicine. Thus, the loss of their lands, territories, and resources results in the deterioration of their capacities to survive and of their resilience. And then I have some conclusions and recommendations. There should be measures to protect Indigenous people's rights, and they must be an integral part of the holistic, intercultural, and gender-based approach in the design and implementation of laws, policies, and programs aimed at addressing such issues. Any effective response to find solutions that fully respect and guarantee the rights of Indigenous women needs to be developed with them and by them. And then Indigenous women are right holders and not simply victims or targets of violations of their human rights. They continue to play an important role in historic struggle for their self-determination of their peoples, their collective and individual rights, and their rights as Indigenous women. Member states should include Indigenous women through their participation, specific focus in questionnaires, and disaggregated data in their reports, programs, and SDG-related work. And also the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as guidance and the recommendations of the Permanent Forum, as well as recommendations from other mechanisms such as the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. I think Anne has done a wonderful job helping to set the framework for the discussions that we will be having today, and the other speakers will be picking up on. I think one of the things that she has demonstrated through her talk is that there has been some progress as far as the United Nations is concerned, the UN Permanent Forum is concerned, where women have been in the forefront, and the special sessions that the women's agenda is integrated into the work of the Permanent Forum. But despite that, there's still many challenges that remain. For example, she has talked about the environment and the land issues, because land signifies more than just land to Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have a spiritual connection to the land, to the Mother Earth, and its food security. And women, in particular, have played a very critical role in this struggle for rights and justice. Anne has given us a number of recommendations, which I'm sure we will be coming back to later. But I don't want to take any more time. I would like to hand over to Sandra Creamer now, who is, I'll just introduce Sandra, who will be talking about the rights, the human rights and the right to be equal. So if I may introduce Sandra. Sandra is a Wani Kalkadun Indigenous woman. Forgive me, Sandra, if I didn't pronounce that correctly, from Australia. She is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Women's Alliance. She's a lawyer and adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland. Sandra was awarded a member of the Order of Australia award on the Queen of England's birthday, 2019, by the Attorney General of Australia for her work with Indigenous women and peoples. I think she has been very consistent and a very strong advocate of the rights. She is on the board of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI, and an advisor to the Seventh Generation Fund. Maybe Sandra will tell us what that Seventh Generation Fund is. She advocates on human rights for Indigenous women and peoples. Some of her work has been writing submissions, articles, writing programs, short film clips, as well as workshops in providing information on how to film and advocate the rights and violations, on legal information, right to health, sustainable development goal, and the environment. Sandra has been in the international arena for many years, and in particular working with Indigenous women globally. Sandra, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm on right now, and that's the land of the Durrumbal people. And I'd also like to acknowledge to all the Indigenous territories that we're speaking from today. Thank you for asking me to speak on the panel and to be with my sisters in having our voice heard worldwide on this webinar. Thank you to all those who are listening and joining in this conversation. I will be discussing human rights and the rights in Australia to be treated equal. First of all, I'm just going to give a quick history of the laws in Australia and the states of Queensland, where I live, that have treated us as lesser people. In 1898, a legislation was passed where we were placed under the Protection Act. This so-called act was for us to become assimilated. This legislation was passed so that we were not allowed to own property or handle money, and women were set out to work as domestics. It was during this time, between 1898 and 1946, that the Industrial Performance Act came in place in 1865. And it was when they were legally allowed to remove Aboriginal children from their family and placed in dormitory-style living or placed in convent homes. In 1946, under the Protection Act, a regulation was then passed that required every Aboriginal person in Queensland, the state that I live in, living on a mission to work 32 hours for free. As we would know it, it's called legalised slavery. This is the hardship that we have had to live under. And most of us for Indigenous peoples around the world, particularly in Australia, United States and in Canada. We had our removal of children. We were forced to work for free and our languages were not to be spoken. We lost our traditional knowledge and we were to remove our identity. Though we know, again, we were not alone in this journey. And sadly, it's also affected many Indigenous peoples around the world. We know that we suffer indirect discrimination, and this is through the laws and policies that the system has made it in a way that it treats us unfairly. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that, how it affects us here in Australia. So as of June 2018, there were 17,787 children who were placed in family care, who were removed from family services and placed out in home care. That is a rate of 59.4% of every children for Aboriginal children in Australia. Most of these children have been removed for neglect viewed by the system to what is neglect by us, and I'll be speaking a bit further on that. So for example, if you came to my house 2 days before I'm paid, there may not be enough food in my house for my children. Food could be limited. Other things could be going on, but not, for example, the children might not have been able to go on school camps and other different things, or, just be taking limited food to school for lunch. I would be seen as neglecting my children. There would be no consideration taken into account that I'm a single parent, that I'm not on a high wage, and I'm trying to keep a roof over my children's head on limited money. This is one of the main concerns for us as women, because most of the single parent household are women. So, and I'll go on and touch on another subject of the indirect discrimination of laws and policies that we have affecting us regarding our deaths in custody. When it comes to a coroner's fact-finding process that is supposed to be substantially resilient, based upon the fact sets of the facts which are collected by the police in their investigation. Meaning police are investigating police, because they are the ones who prepare the reports here in Australia when it comes to deaths in custody for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. That means that they're conducting a second rate of investigation. This then, when it gets to the coroner, it limits his abilities to having any sort of finding. So that means that when the coroner is notified of a death, the police investigate and they conduct the report. That then goes to the coroner, and then they find that there's no criminal offence has been found when it comes to deaths in custody in Australia. One of the other indirect discriminations and laws and policies that affect us is that out in our remote communities, especially for our women, most of them live on a basic card. A basic card means that there's very limited funds, and on that basic card, they only have to go to certain shops to buy something. So they have limited money, cash in their hand. This then limits them to have a credit rating to buy a house or a car, or to even get a small loan. And most of our women, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women in this country, they would like to start their own businesses, but because of a basic card, they are not even able to access any loan. As we know, most of our women are gifted from their traditional knowledge of painting and making jewellery. So where is our self-determination? With our gifts of knowledge in our traditional ways of painting and making jewellery, we'd like to be able to move forward to make an economic gain and to gain our self-determination. But we cannot do that because of the oppression of living on a basic card that only allows us that limited cash. Where is our rights to self-determination? One of the laws, and again, I'll give another example of the indirect laws and policies that are affecting us here. One of the laws that we also have is in the Family Law Court is called a relocation order. For example, if there's an Aboriginal Torres Strait Aboriginal woman living on another community with her partner on his community, and there's a serious domestic violence, and she takes out a domestic violence order out on him, and then she wants to move to her own community to be with her family and to get that support, and also to make a new life away from that violence, she cannot leave under a relocation order, even if there has been a serious domestic violence offence caused against her. This is because the order may find that the children may have not been involved in the domestic violence order, and the father under the law has the right to share the children, 50-50 sharing. So where does that leave our women, Aboriginal women, and that then leads them to have can lead to depression or to mental health issues. I've worked in this area where I have seen many women suffer serious depression because they are not allowed to relocate. They may have to live in that community with that man and all of his family and his cousins and everybody for at least another 10 years until those children are older. So what happens to us? We know that in 1967, the United Nations member states adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which states that discrimination against women is an offence against human dignity and calls on all states to abolish existing laws, customs, regulations and practices which are discriminatory against women and to establish adequate legal protection for equal rights of men and women. We don't have those rights. Those existing laws and those regulations and practices, they are still discriminative to us in Australia, to us Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women in Australia. We do, as I was stating in those, it is indirect discrimination that is still exists today, and it holds us in a situation where we're not able to move forward, when we're not able to raise our voices, we're not allowed to also seek self-determination as an Indigenous women in our own country. We know that women's rights are human rights, and we need to remember that the Sustainable Development Goals, it states, leave no one behind. Yet we, as Indigenous women in this country and around the world, we are left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that very, very strong, insightful presentation. What you have said in terms of what the Indigenous peoples, but especially the women, go through. You have talked about the laws in Australia. I mean, this is, to some extent, the whole colonization process, though you didn't use the word colonization, has affected us in the global south in many different ways. And even in the north, we know what's happening to the Black people, the indigenous people in the US, the North America, which you have mentioned. And, but the fact that even today the laws, the historical injustices are still not being addressed. The gaps are not narrowing. And for women, they suffer even more, women and the children. It becomes a vicious cycle of injustice and poverty and discrimination. So thank you so much for enlightening us this whole issue of, I mean, even though some of us who may have read a little bit, we have not maybe truly understood the extent of the impact of the legalized slavery, as you called it, and what can happen to a society when the whole essence, the basic structures are destroyed. I think that's what has happened. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you after this, but I would like to now move on to Lucy Mullen-Kay, who will now bring in a different dimension of the role of Indigenous women. I will just give me a minute to introduce Lucy. Lucy is an Indigenous Maasai woman from Kenya, and she's many things. She's the executive director of the Indigenous Information Network. She's also a founder of the African Indigenous Women's Organization and also co-founder of International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI, which we referred to earlier, and the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. She has over 2 decades of experience working as a journalist on environment and development on project management. A gender and development graduate, she is an ardent advocate of women's rights and human rights. For over 20 years, she has worked with rural communities and indigenous peoples and local communities on different development activities, especially on environmental conservation, focusing on the different conventions on biodiversity, climate change desertification, Minimata, I'm not sure what that is. Lucy, maybe you'll tell us what that is. Pollutants and chemicals. Currently, she co-chairs the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and chairs Global Environmental Facilities Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. Most of the work requires a lot of travel, as it does for our other panelists as well, and a lot of networking, which is very crucial to connect with the world and more so with other indigenous peoples and women, to exchange, share, and bring to the local level in the African continent. She's also a member of the coordinating committee of the International Alliance of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples of the Tropical Forest.
I go ahead, Sheila?
So Lucy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheila, for inviting me, and thank you to the other panelists, Tarsila, Anna, and Sandra. And I think what Anne started by presenting about the permanent forum and about the illegal instruments that are present there to kind of protect indigenous peoples in their rights and so on, relates to what Sandra has spoken about. And it also relates to what I'm going to speak about, because I'm going to talk about indigenous women and sustainable development, that is indigenous women and girls. And why do I want and speak about this, and why is it always very close to my heart? Because one thing you should know is that as indigenous peoples, especially from Africa, from Asia, and from even Latin America, and Sandra has just mentioned that, and throughout the world, indigenous peoples have been brought up in nature, in their lands, where they are able to, all their lives, their economy everything is just within that particular land because it's near nature. Their life is spent just like, this is the land God has given us. We have all these natural resources that are given to us. It's our duty to make sure we care for them and look after for the next generation. But looking at all that, and especially looking at the issues of land, because Anne spoke a little bit about land, and also the presentation for Sandra related also to the land, is that the land is what really is closer to us, because that land is what identified you. Where do you come from? I'm from this particular area. This is our land. And that's where you get all that is natural from it. If it is the hunter-gatherers who we have in Africa, for example, they depend totally on the forest areas and so on. The other pastoralists depend on the land for their livestock and for everything. We also have some indigenous communities who adopted agriculture, and they do small-scale agriculture to feed their families and so on. And all these also depends on the land. But we have seen at the same time that we are now in a time when the land is no longer what we thought or what we had before. Our land has been squeezed, have become smaller because of many things. It has become smaller because of encroachment of other people. It has become smaller because the land has been divided in different people. Different people have taken their parcels of land so that they can also be able to give way for development, as they say. And some of the land also has been, used for large-scale farming. For example, in some areas, even in the Maasai area, you find that there is large-scale farming on sugarcane. There is also on wheat and barley, and also others. We have other development things. In Africa, we have even mining going on in some places, like in Tanzania and others. So there is quite a lot of activities that go within that particular land. And also, I think the economy of the pastoralists has kind of changed. So it has become a bit more different. Life has become different. The population, the migration by the more stronger people going to the towns to look for jobs because their lands cannot be able to be productive anymore because of climate change, because of deforestation, which has invited the encroachment of drought and becoming more. So the land has become a bit of a different than the way it was. Now, when we come to look at the question of the role of women in all this, we are speaking about land and so on. And you know, the land itself and the women is also very important because that's where they got the food, that is where they got the medicinal plants for giving to their families and children and also the community at large. So this is very, very important for them. And now when a land is taken and divided and demarcated and the women are not given that right to own or to access that land, it becomes a big problem. And this is where we have had a lot of problems because even despite the fact that our constitutions, many constitutions say that a woman is also supposed to own the land, a girl child is supposed to be given to inherit a land and so on. In practical sense, very little happens, or even no more happens. And we see a lot of indigenous women, especially from Africa, where we have quite a number of widows who have been working with them, and it has been a struggle in terms of looking at the issue of land and trying to see how they can be able to own that particular land which has been left by their husbands and their family. But all that, we won't say that the life has gone down, and probably we talk about other issues of poverty and so on. As indigenous women, we've been trying to work together and trying to make sure that we are able to come up with strategies so that those strategies can be able to help our women. When we discuss with different women in Africa, because we have a network, and as Sheila said, for me, for many years, I believe that you can only take the information to the people, get it from them also, and it's a two-way. And the more you discuss and the more you give ideas and the more you share what you have is very important for Indigenous people. Because in the fact that we were living in a traditional way of life, where we looked at our languages, we looked at our art, we looked at our food, and we looked at everything around us, everything around life, that is life within us, is what we protected and looked after it. And we have to continue to do that. And because of changes, there came globalization. There came so many paradigms of development, and all those have impacted on our way of life. They have impacted on our traditions, on our cultures, on the art, on the dressing and the food that we eat and everything that we do. So it's very important to make sure that we continue engaging the Indigenous women, girls, and also the community to try and tell them exactly what is happening and how can we be able to still maintain our traditions and our cultures, but make sure that we are also developing and moving ahead with the other people. And it's very interesting that most of the communities out there, and especially women, have seen the impact and have really felt it, because they can no longer get the traditional medicine that they used to go and collect outside there to prepare and give to the children. Because if you look at them, they all live in remote areas. There are many areas, like you go to some of these large counties in my country, Sheila, and you find that you have to walk for maybe 2 hours before you find a dispensary or anything, or a shop or anything. And these traditional medicines were very good because they are the ones that kept the communities going and so on. So what has happened is that they have also seen that dwindle and disappear. Most of the, actually, when I go to where I grew, I can no longer get the traditional medicine that I was brought up with, because it has all been cut down, it's been, disappeared and so on. So we said, as women, as Indigenous women, get together, try to see how you can plant it, and start with a small kitchen garden, just to give the practical an example. We started up with encouraging the women to make sure that they have kitchen gardens behind their house and plant those little medicine that they are missing, because the medicine women and the traditional birth attendants sometimes have to walk very far to get that. And what we have also made sure that we make it happen is that we have had exchange visit. As I work with quite a number of a big number of Indigenous women, we exchange, and we started with the East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. We exchange among ourselves, and they look at, because the traditions and the cultures are the same, it's only that we are in different ecosystems and we are in different countries. And we've been able to make sure that we exchange the women so that they can learn from each other, and then these other women can also collect and share some of these traditional medicines and what was happening and what is happening now, and also share the food that they have, share the seeds that have disappeared. And it brings back us again to the life that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, we all believed in having and protecting and conserving that what is life within us that helps us to be who we are. And indeed, there are quite a number of other instruments that have been trying to support us and trying to really make sure that the issue of sustainable development, issues of traditional knowledge are recognized, and that the women can continue to work on that slowly in their own areas. And we also advocate that we have to involve the other members of the family, because that's the only way you can be able to access further and be able to have a bit of more piece of land added to you, because the men would not like to just use that particular land. But because of what the women have been doing and trying to involve everybody in the family, we've had quite a lot of changes in some of the areas, but we still have to work a lot. And I'm glad that Anne also mentioned issues of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous People, and also the Indigenous women have actually been working together very closely on issues of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which makes even our government to recognize who we are. As you know, that the issue of Indigenous people in Africa is still a big challenge, and many governments have to accept it. and be able to involve them. One of the other biggest problem that we have also experienced is that even in decision making, we don't see women being involved a lot. If we just see a few women involved, it's not really enough. We want those women who are living in the remote areas, who are doing a lot of work, because right now they've been planting and making a lot of, different kind of indigenous trees and indigenous species and medicinal plants, and trying to recover what they had lost. So this is very important if the governments and other key players in our development in Africa do recognize that. And I think we have really done a lot of good work in terms of trying to advocate for that. And we still hope that the Convention on Biological Diversity will still support us, and I think it will, because right now we have the executive director, whom I want to congratulate, from Africa, and she has also been very keen and working on environmental issues from UNEP and so on. And one of the other things that I want to say is that working together is very important in issues of collaboration. It's very important to collaborate among ourselves. We would like to have adhere the women from Australia who are working on a sustainable development. We've been working a lot with Indigenous women from Latin America to share our experiences and so on. We want to continue having the exchange visit among the women, not only from East Africa, but to go beyond. And we've been able to work with women from Cameroon, West Africa. We also have our networks who are really working very closely in terms of looking at a different aspect. We also have our networks who are really working. Very thing that we have encouraged the women is to have knowledge centers where they work. Because even if you are working as Indigenous women on your own different groups, you also have to come together and work and share among yourselves. And we have advised many of the Indigenous women to have knowledge centers within their own area of work, so that they can come there and exchange that knowledge. They can come and share. They can come and get the seeds and share and be able, because there's always somebody with one knowledge and the other has a bit something to add. So we've had actually in Kenya, for example, we have one in Transmara in Narok County, and Olulunga, which is also in Narok County. We have one in Marsabit in Merigo. We have one also in West Pokot in a place, very remote place called Naramam. And we are developing more as we move on. We also have one in Karamoja in Uganda, in Moroto, which is also a very good center. And actually during this time of COVID, it was very important, because that center, the older women came in there for shelter. Because we told the women, please, it's now COVID, we have to really be very careful and look after the elders to make sure that they have enough food and they are comfortable, so that they don't really get, we don't lose them simply because they don't have enough. We also are looking forward to starting one in Tanzania in a place called Longido, not very far from Kenya, and Kimokowa, just near Namanga on the other side, and so on. So this is all to make sure that we have people who can come and sit there and talk, and also involve girls, young ladies. We have a big program where we have young, we call it the Viva program, where we have young girls who come every holiday. We take them through some trainings, and part of those trainings are issues of sustainable development. In fact, before the COVID, we already had a program set to talk to them about climate change, so that they can be the ambassadors of climate change in the community, and they can move around. That helps them also to be able to learn much more from the elders and from the other people whom we are working with. And we are talking to people, to our colleagues, as I said, from DRC, from South Africa. And South Africa, you know, we have the San communities where we have in Uppington, Kimberley, Cape Town, and other areas. In Cameroon already, we have the Mbororo, who are the pastoralists there. And then we have a big family of the Pygmy family, the Baka, and so on. And all those, all we say is, let's work together. Let there be exchange between the hunter-gatherers. They have their own networks. The pastoralists have their own networks. And women, we have a WhatsApp for the African Indigenous women, so that we can reach out among ourselves, and especially at this time of COVID, to be able to make sure that nothing disappears, what we have already been having and what we have put in place. As you know very well, this is a very dangerous time. is where we are losing a lot of other important, like land being misused, deforestation, and so on. And of course, we have also a lot of conflict. So what I want to do, let me give some recommendations, because I've been timing myself and I'm already 15 minutes. One of the most important things that I want to bring out, because this is a very large discussion, is a discussion that we believe that we have, when we work with women, we really succeed. Not that because I'm a woman, but I think most of the activities that we've been doing, when you start activities with women, you see that they really look forward, because that they know that since they are the ones who have the biggest and the heaviest workload in the community, they are responsible and they have to really make sure that life will work within them. They are the ones who feed the people. They are the ones who know where shelter is. They are the ones who know where the children go. So one of the most important things is that I would like to urge our partners, different stakeholders, to make sure that they support Indigenous people's work, and especially Indigenous women and girls. This is very important, especially for donors, to make sure that at least they can focus on building, giving funding for support of capacity building, and also for other trainings for sustainable development and for their protection of their traditional knowledge. They have a lot and they would like to document some of it so that it doesn't disappear. They would like to share that knowledge with the young people. And for the governments, I think it's very important they look back. If the international processes are looking at issues of traditional knowledge, the governments also have to look at that and have really to appreciate our different communities in our region, Africa, which is rich in art, language, music, everything that is there for our sustainability, our food security. They are the ones who have actually gone back now to look for our old seeds, to bring them back, because of, as you know, GMOs had destroyed part of our continent for a very long time. And this has not been healthy for many communities. At this time of COVID, these are the women who know and who are listening to make sure that they give their families very healthy food to keep them going. Otherwise, without that, it would never be, we would never be existing as much as we would like to. So Sheila, I think I would like to stop there, and then we can continue to add more as we discuss in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that very interesting presentation. Of course, the theme of land and the importance of land to all the Indigenous peoples come through very clearly in your presentation. But for me, I think one of the major takeaway is the importance of collaborating and working together as Indigenous people, whether you're pastoralists or you're hunter-gatherers, and for women in particular, but also the importance of reviving the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
The knowledge has been destroyed,
Completely.
whether it is in Kenya, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Finland, and in Peru, Latin America, as Tarsila will be telling us. So I think that is very important. You've shared a lot of some good practices of things that you're doing to revive the knowledge and to train the young people, passing on the knowledge to the younger generations. Knowledge that has been lost, yet that is the knowledge that helped you to survive in the past, and it still has a role to play in today's world, where your land is being taken away, the encroachment of the land in the name of development. That draws attention to what really is development, because even Sandra talked about it. Because all the injustices on the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islanders was also done in the name of development. So what does that really mean? Maybe we keep that question for later when we talk about in our discussions. With that, I'd like to turn towards Tarsila Rivera. Thank you.
Sheila, before you turn to Tarsila, I think you asked me a question about Minamata.
Yes, what is Minamata?
On mercury. mercury, because of the mining that has been taking place, especially with the small scale mining and others, they've been using mercury. And mercury is very dangerous. And so the UN convention that discusses on different pollutants and so on really works so much to make sure that we have a convention in that, so that it can prevent the use of, it can stop the use of mercury, and also be able to work with other people to stop it, because it's a very dangerous thing that has destroyed many lives of the small scale people and women, especially women and girls. And that's why I've been very keen on it, because it's very, very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lucy. So with that, I will turn to Tarsila Rivera Shea. I am not sure whether I've pronounced your name correctly, but forgive me if I haven't. I'd like to introduce Tarsila, who has joined us all the way from Peru. Tarsila is one of the most recognized indigenous activists in Peru and indeed in the whole world. For more than 30 years, she has been defending indigenous rights through her organization, Chirapac, and has her involvement in other networks and institutions focusing on indigenous women, children, and youth. She has received awards from UNICEF, Ford Foundation, Sacred Fire Foundation, and the Ministry of Culture, Peru, for her distinguished trajectory and valued contributions to the promotion and defense of indigenous cultures and rights. She served as a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for the period 2017 to 2019. She is also a founding member of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas, and currently its coordinator for the period 2020 to 2023. She is also founder of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI, which I think the others, Lucy is also part of, and a founder. These two networks foster leadership and political participation of millions of indigenous women around the globe. Tarsila is founder and vice president of Chirapac, Center for Indigenous Cultures of Peru, an association that promotes the affirmation of cultural identity and the formation of women and young indigenous leaders, many of whom now serve in public office in the communities and local government. So she's a great mentor to many young people, and for passing on knowledge and skills. So Tarsila, I'd like to invite you to talk about indigenous women and the environment, with a special focus on Latin America and Peru. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and very nice to me to see you and listen to all of you. Thank you, Sheila, for inviting me. Sisters Sandra, Lucy, and Anne. And I think this is an opportunity to share the problems, visions, and hopes to change the situation in our regions from our positions or activists. No? In this case, I will talk Spanglish. Excuse me for my Spanglish. But from my region, I will take some specific points because my sisters made a very good information globally. No? As you mentioned, in the last studio of ILO Convention, we are arriving more than 4,080 million as indigenous peoples. In my region, we are 55 million as indigenous population in the the Latin America. And women, we are half of this population, near to 25 million or 28. And as we listen, and all of us know, we have very good international advances as instruments. As indigenous peoples, like my sister Anne mentioned, and as indigenous women, we participate from Cairo 94 and Beijing 95. And in the last years, we try to understand how the international arena can help us to change the national and local situations. That's the first challenge for us. How the local situations can use, appropriate the international instruments about our rights as indigenous peoples and as women. In this context, in Latin America, we have a lack implementation of the international agreements. That's our problem. What happened with the very good advocacy and advances in international arena during decades to see the change in our local places. In this situation, in Latin America, ECLAC said that we are the very unequal region. The gap is very high between poor and not poor. Or we have another scale is extreme poverty. The indigenous peoples in our region is included in the extreme poverty. Why? As you know, we are talking about natural resources, our knowledge, our historical existent but resistant with activities and taking care the resources, the mother nature, the healthy environmental, and we analyzing that we arrive one very biggest problem in our region. The economic policy of our states, the development of economy from the states is based in principally in the extractive industries. And what happened with this? We have all the impacts about the owner of our lands, who are the owner of the lands, and we have constitutions in our region, national constitutions. Only one case said that we are owner of our land, but in other case, majority said that we can use the land, but not the resource inside the land. And in this situation, we suffer all kind of expropriation of the land, and the impact of these extractive industries push us to the extreme poverty, because many families have to go out of the community without nothing. And in this context, we are suffering how terrible is the exclusion and racism in the exercise of the power in our region. Because when we talk about the pandemic, which sector are more vulnerable or in situation of vulnerability in this context of pandemic? Indigenous peoples. In this case, principally the Amazonian region, because the geographical. But globally, we are discussing about the forest, about we need to change the impact of climate change, to preserve our knowledge, to preserve our natural resources. When you see from indigenous women or indigenous peoples, these kind of discussions, no? And you see the reality, we said, wow, how we can join the, how do you say, the objective looking as an important actor to peoples. We talk about human being, for example, how the impact of extractive industries are going to kill, for example, the human rights defenders, the indigenous rights defenders, or the environmental defenders, natural resources defenders. We need to have a proper and common vision to defend and protect principally healthy life for everybody. That's the conviction of indigenous women when we talk about what Lucy said, what Anna said, what Sandra said. How we can change this system with our input, with our sharing our knowledge, and trying to see to the same direction. We need to protect this kind of resource. We need to listen about this kind of use of the resource and guarantee the life and natural resources for next generations. Because when we talk, for example, to our elders, they said, we in the past, we had no problem about food sovereignty, because the animals, because the plants, because the river was clean, and we had fish, but now everything is dying or disappearing. And my sister Lucy talked about the mercury. How can we understand that mining company can use the land of indigenous communities or people to put there the waste of that mining, like mercury? And in the community, the children don't know what's that and try to play with that because they think it's something natural. And after we have problem of health and the impact in their health with toxics, for example, and not only in the life of the people on the in the land too, because when we try to produce our potatoes or our maize or other products for food, the land is with toxic, not only with this kind of mining, of extractive, of the mining, but with the pesticides too. And how we can change all this practice. I think when Lucy talk about the necessity to work together, we need to build a common point, maybe 3 or 4, and push as women and as indigenous women or people, push this kind of important points to guarantee the healthy life, peace, extreme or poverty, and violence. My dear, all kind of violence in our region. Because when we talk about the impact of extractive industries, violence, environmental violence, including the sexual rights, no harassment for foreigners to our girls. The principal way of violence, we as Indigenous women in my region define the racism and discrimination as heritage of the colonialism and colonization. How the attitude of a racist ideology in our people impact very deep in our self-esteem. Because when officially the governors or politicians or decision makers don't take us in the public policy with proper inclusion, we think that we are people without rights. We are not human like others. My dear, we need to change that, because many countries in my region say, no, we are not racist, we are not blah, blah, blah. The discrimination is the expression of racism. No equal distribution or democratic distribution of the public funds, no public policy including all of us, no education appropriate for Indigenous peoples and women, when we are monolingual and they are imposing the official language and culture, because we are invisible until now. That's our problem. And but when they need to the activity of income economy, are thinking in the resources situated in Indigenous peoples' communities. When they try to use the tourism industry, they are thinking in Indigenous cultures, Indigenous dance, music. But when they distribute the income of these economic activities, we are absent. We are excluded, are not in the map or statistics or in the plan. That's why we need to continue struggling together, trying to understand the international advances, to go to regional mechanisms, like in my region, for example, the Inter-American system. We have many advances as in international instruments, but we need to go down to the national implementation of these advances. That's why we are very proud about the process of Indigenous women from local to global, from local Chirapa or Pujas, national Peru, regional, the continental network, and globally with International Forum of Indigenous Women. We are trying to have, how do you say, recommendations, or to be more visible. But the challenge is what is happening and what is changing in our national and local arena, because we are defending the life of our peoples, but the life of Mother Nature, from where we eat, we live, we know, and for humanity. We need to understand that, and all kind of racism, discrimination is necessary to eliminate because it's expression of violence, and to be very attent, is possible to say, to the expression of we listen neoliberalism, yes, but neocolonialism, because we need to decolonize everything, not to have, yes, because you are very good, we want, and many national programs in our countries, when they talk in indigenous women, program assistant. We said, no, we don't need a program for assist with food. We need investment with dignity, because we know how to use and what to do and how we can work together to the development of our region or country or family. Historically, we did that. That's what I want to share with you. As you know, we have many recommendations from Commission Status of Women. We work very hard the last 15 years or 25 years. We have many recommendations from Permanent Forum specific for indigenous women. And we have many recommendations about environment and land and natural resources from different parts. We are trying to understand how we can contribute to eliminate the violence in our body, in our life, and in our territory. Because for us, racism manage the mind of the politicians, and they are doing bad, very bad. We need to change that. And in this case, we need to think about the new generation. What are we doing for the new generation, and to build their conscience as citizens in our societies, not only as excluded sector. We need to work that. And thank you very much for invite me, and to all our sisters and brothers listen us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarsila. That was a very passionate and eloquent presentation, which in a way links up so well with all the other presentations. What struck me most of my takeaway, the very powerful words where she asked, are we not humans like others? She also talked about the invisibility of the indigenous peoples. And the invisibility, yet at this, because you're not on the maps, not on the statistics, not in the planning process, the voices of indigenous people are not in the planning processes. But when it comes to thinking of resources in the indigenous communities, the resources are taken away, the extractive industries. There's also, she talked about, as did Sandra and others, talked about the racism, the inherent racism, and the expression which links to the expression of violence, economic violence, sexual and gender-based violence, and other forms of violence. And I think one of the things Anne started by talking about the international instruments. And Tarsila is bringing us down to earth. Yes, the international instruments are there. They might even be there at the regional level. But how are these translated into, how are they translated into the national, the local level? What difference are these international instruments making to the lives of the ordinary, everyday indigenous people and the women? And I really like what she talked about, that all actually, Tarsila and Sandra and Lucy and Anne, you're all defenders of life, of your people, but also defenders of the life of Mother Nature and of humanity. I think that's, and finally, she talked about decolonizing the mind and decolonizing practices. And what you need is investment with dignity. Going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier about development. What really is development? What does it mean? So what you need is investment with dignity. Thank you so much, Tarsila, for that presentation. I think there are very many questions that our audience have been asking. I don't want to take any more time, and I would like to hand over to Declan. All of you have been very patient, our audience and the panelists. Anne had to step out for a little while. I'm sure she'll be back before we end. But I'll hand over to Declan to ask the questions to the three panelists who are here now. Thank you, Declan.
Thank you so much, Dr. and to our panelists. That was really, really quite engaging and intense. And I do have a bunch of questions that are being curated from various contributors across the globe who are actually tuned in and listening. So the first question is actually from Iqbal, who's based in Nairobi. And the question is, how should Indigenous women work with other marginalized groups to address joint structures of inequality? And this is a general question to any panelist. So the question is, how are Indigenous women work with other marginalized groups to address joint structures of inequality? I think I'd like to point at Lucy. I think she touched on this quite a bit. So Lucy, if you don't mind, you could give the question a go.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you also, Iqbal, for asking that question. Right now, I think, as I talked about collaboration, networking and working together is very, very crucial. And indeed, Indigenous women have also been working a lot with other local communities around them and local women around them. And some of them are even minorities who are scattered in different areas, because we have categories of different communities we have in our country. And when he is asking about other marginalized communities, they could be also local communities who are living around the same area with our Indigenous people. And they could also be minorities who are probably separated and staying in their own and have their own self-isolation, because we have communities in different countries like Ethiopia and other countries where we have some communities who have decided to isolate themselves because they fear to be, the moment they are mixed up with the other community, in the mainstream community, they will always disappear, their land will be taken away, and their cultures will disappear. But we do encourage a lot the issue of collaboration, because as you know very well, it's very difficult to work on your own. You will never know and have any information from anywhere. And if you are working and living with the same communities around you, you need also to educate them and to kind of enhance their capacity and give them examples of what you are doing. Some of them are even communities who are married within, because the marriage and intermarriages and different communities living among themselves, they will always mix. So it's something that we really do advocate for. And sometimes we even invite them in our own meetings so that they can be able to learn. And we always say, as Sandra had said earlier, we do a lot also on sustainable development goals. And the goal always is leave no one behind. Because even if you are protecting your environment, even if you are putting things well in your own land there, and you have the neighbor who is destructive and destroying, you will not succeed. So the best way is to make sure that you work together so that you can be able to advance in your goals and objectives, and also to make sure that these communities do not continue to be marginalized. And we also advocate that even we as Indigenous peoples, we know we have some Indigenous people who marginalize others. We do not allow this. We would like always to make sure that we work collectively, because our traditions, our cultures tell us that collectiveness is very, very important for us. And I think it's something that is in our customary laws, that we really have to work together as a team in order to succeed the enemy. And that enemy will always feel a bit defeated because of the strength that we have when we are many together. Thank you. Your microphone is off. I can't hear you.
Oh, pardon me. Thank you so much, Lucy, for that. I don't know if there's any other panelists who'd like to add to this question. Otherwise, we'd proceed to the next. Great. So the next question is actually related to this first question, and it's from Rana from Hawaii. And Rana's question is, during this pandemic, has the voice of the ordinary woman or ordinary women heard? And how do they reach such platforms such as webinars, workshops and conferences, etc.? Again, this is a general question, and I think I'm pretty interested what Sandra thinks around this.
Thank you. I think one of the issues is that, how are they reached? How are they heard? How are they able to access webinars? It's very difficult, especially the ordinary women. And I'm a firm believer that, everyone says that, we have access to technology and all of these sorts of things. No, we don't. Some of the ordinary women, they're not on the phone texting us saying that we need help, we're in a domestic violence, or I'm losing my job or anything. And this is a sad situation for many women around the world, Indigenous women and also all women, because, everybody relies on technology. We don't have that in place. So I think the saddest part is that for those women, the ordinary women who don't have access to technology and to access webinars, I think one of the main things is for us to be able to hear their voices is that we actually need to go out into the communities at times and reach out ourselves to some of the women that do. And it's difficult to know who they are, where they are, and to be able to share what information that we have. And I'll give an example. In remote communities in Australia, at the moment, majority of them are locked down. And what happens is that I don't have access to a lot of remote communities at all, to the women that I generally work with. So how am I able to access them, to get hold of them, to be able to provide any information? One of the things is that by looking for service providers that do go out to remote communities, I actually send out information to them. I send fact sheets. We've done a lot of fact sheets on domestic violence, on the COVID-19, on healthcare, we have an app that's being developed on your rights to the apps and everything. So I actually send out those fact sheets to service providers that I know that are reaching those women. Another thing that we've actually done here in the community that I live in, we've actually been able to put together food kits, and we go and knock on those women's doors or those people's homes who we know don't have technology. That's a way of checking in to see how they are, and to also if there's any issues, but also for us to give them information on about protecting themselves, about the issues of the COVID-19. So I think at times we have to do the basic things that we used to do before and go and check on people and knock on people's doors. If we can't do it personally, find those service providers that do and that can deliver that message to the person who does not have technology. Thank you.
Magero, can I add on that?
Sure, of course.
So one of the things that I think Sandra has brought it up, and we realize that us in Africa, even though we have these webinar, I mean, we had this WhatsApp group on African Indigenous women, but when it comes to issues of the webinar, it's problematic. Even for those with the phones, and you know, Africa, the cell phones are there all over, and you can buy, you know, a cheap. You can always have somebody even from the remotest area with a cell phone, but that does not give you the possibility of communicating and getting information. That's where it's a big challenge. Even those of us who have got phones and so on, which are a bit upgraded, we find that most of our Indigenous women cannot access to be able to even be in a webinar. We had a webinar yesterday, and we had about 10 of them on the WhatsApp saying, I can't connect, I can't get there, I can do there. So it's still a very big challenge, as what Sheila, Sandra has mentioned. And I think we need to strategize and see what other mechanisms that we can be able to reach out. And in our discussion, we had some colleagues from Latin America even now have gone back to try to use radio to send out information, because you cannot only rely on the webinars, but you have to get other strategies and other ways that you can be able to reach out for the women, so that at least you can go to the remotest part, even for the youth and so on. They can get to that technology where you can communicate throughout. Thank you.
I think Declan has his connection has dropped, so I will take over
Okay.
the questions.
No?
So thank you
May I?
very much for that, Lucy. Did Tarsila want to add anything to that?
Yes, please.
Yes, please go ahead. Just a
The
minute. Lucy, can you tell?
problem of technology and communication in the community or for grassroots organizations or women is a pendant agenda. Because if we have Wi-Fi, for example, in some regions, but you need another instruments and you need to learn how to use. We need to relate the access to information and technology related with exclusion and with no inclusion in public policy and with extreme poverty, because we have all the barriers to access. That's why when we talk about Indigenous women, we need to see all the map. We are in the communities. You can imagine how is in Africa, how is in different regions, what we have and what we need to be informed. And we need to see the Indigenous women and people in the popular area in the cities, with poverty, with no employ, with not good education, no? And all these barriers, it's necessary to see how we can contribute to eliminate that barriers. And in the communities, we in this pandemic context, as Lucy mentioned, or you to go to radio, we went back to use the, how do you say, the repetition in local with battery, with voice in the community, not radio, but the, how do you say, very elemental way of repeat the information. I don't remember the name of this word, but it's when you put in the battery and the speaker loud, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, And not only that, because they are instrument, but we need to ask to the policymakers about communication, how they transmit the information, because they are thinking that all of us have clean water, soap, and we need to do, no. We need to see all the regions and to have appropriate message in each context. As indigenous peoples, for example, we need to decodificate the message in the proper culture and try to give the information in proper language and meaning in the culture, and maybe that kind of information will be more effective than to say you have to use clean water, blah, 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 or education by internet, my dear. How we can talk about education in online in this condition? Because the Minister of Education said everybody education online. And what happened with the communities? Oh my God, thank you.
Tarsila, I think that one is called listening groups, where you have a tape and then you put in the cassettes that we used to use some years back, and then the communities can be able to listen to that on their own.
Thank you for that, Lucy. I hand over back to Declan, who's the perfect example of how technology does not always work, because he dropped. His connection dropped, but he's back now. So we were still on the same question you had asked, and we really got very rich responses on the issues of relevance, access. I think access is very important. We cannot assume everybody has access. And also the relevance of the messages and all the different strategies that they're using during this time to reach out to the common person out there. So back to you, Declan.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for the technical hitch I experienced. I think next question from Amal, who's based in Nairobi, is focused on how would you reflect on communities' coping mechanism to rapid urbanization and land rights, given that in most geographies, indigenous people's way of life is based on pastoralism. So how would you reflect on the community's coping mechanisms to rapid urbanization and land rights? And I think I think all the panelists did touch on the issue of conservation, more or less, and the aspect of land. And I don't know if Anne is here. It would be great to hear from her. Again, this is a general question. Any one of you can chime in.
Is Anne back? No.
Oh, great. Lucy, probably you can go. Give it a go.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that Sandra could pick it up first, and also Tarsila will also add to that, because you have brought it quite clearly, the issue of the urban, and which has actually been caused by the land back in our rural areas. And that's why most of the people have migrated from the rural areas to the cities. And if you go to any of the towns in all these countries, not only in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and wherever, you'll find that the population of indigenous people in urban centers is growing. And they continue to grow up there, though they try to come up with to try and safeguard their cultures and tradition. It's also been a big challenge. And we've always wanted to know which is this country that we can go and see how much they have been able to succeed in terms of still guarding what they have. The only issue and the only biggest challenge that we have, especially in Africa, is that now, because of this rural-urban migration, the people who are left behind are the women, because men at this particular time, like If you go now to Kenya, because you are a Kenyan, you go to Marsabit and you go to Turkana or to other places, it's very dry at the moment also. They don't have enough rain. So most of the pastures, most of the livestock has migrated, gone to look for pasture. So the only people who are left at home are women and children. And of course, now the schools are also closed, they are all there, which brings again another more dynamic way of survival for those communities. And that's why we are saying that working together is very important, and especially for the governments to take note of that and be able to go there. The other biggest problem we have, I think, the laws that are there are really, as Tarsila had also said, that the laws that are there, they don't look at many dynamics. They don't look at how much that impact of why are we migrating, even despite the fact that we have counties at this moment. Why are people migrating? What's happening to people's land? So these are some of the things that need to be taken very closely. And land issues, even I know the African Commission, the AU has written a lot and discussed a lot with governments on issues of land, but we'll always have challenges. And I think I give Sandra to continue from there.
Sandra.
Oh, hi. Yes, for Indigenous peoples, one of the main issues is really the migration and forced migration as well, and into more urban areas. And that's a really big concern, because once that happens, that's when we lose our language. And once we start losing our language, we then lose our traditional knowledge, and then we lose our identity, and that sort of that, we then start assimilating and once we've lost all of that, we don't want to become a memory, and we don't want to say, and you do find that with Indigenous peoples. I know where my father come from, there's only just a little bit of there's trees and everything there, but there was a history there, and that's what's happening to Indigenous people. I don't want it that in another 2 generations, our children, our great-grandchildren are going to be saying, well, there used to be a house here where we used to be able to live, or someone lived, or there was a language that was spoken here. And so we've really got to sort of look together as a collective. How do we overcome those challenges that are forcing us, or that we're moving into urban areas, and, we some of us, are losing all of that. We have lost that here in Australia. I think one of the biggest issues is that, governments really don't care, simply because of the minerals on our lands, and that, and corporations and mining companies, they're one of the biggest issues that Indigenous peoples are having land issues and debates with, and land fights. No matter where you go in this world, Indigenous people are all fighting for their lands. And I think, we have to really start making challenges on what our rights are. And I'm a firm believer, because having a law background, that, we have to really take on some of these people and some of these companies and organisations, and even the government themselves. I mean, over here, we've got to look at, okay, well, for example, if there's a community where there is, there's a lot of our communities, they're also running on bore waters. They don't have fresh water or anything, and they're getting water from below the ground. And, we've got to challenge the government, and because they have a duty of care to us as peoples. And I think one of those duties, they miss out on those duties of care. And through those duties of care, there's also obligations in the international UN arena. And we've got to start making them more accountable. I think what we have to do is challenge them more in the legal system, and also voicing and making them more accountable. We need to start calling out governments. We need to start calling out our own people who are in support of having mining companies and all of those different things. I'm really very concerned about the issues of migrations and forced migrations of Indigenous peoples in the world, because, like I said, in another 2 generations, I don't want us to be just become a memory, when we are really just a growing number of people in the world now. There was so much genocide for Indigenous peoples, but we're growing again, and we've really got to work together as a collective. And I think that's why the international arena, like the Permanent Forum, is really important for Indigenous peoples to be there. And I think, you know, the limitation that they're putting on us now is 20 people to be able to go from one organisation, and it may be getting smaller. It's putting us down, you know, they're breaking us down. And you know, as we know, you know, if we're large in numbers, we've got a larger voice. So I think really, you know, we just need to keep working together as we do with FEMI. We are a group of women, we're a collective voice, and we educate and we run workshops and we run information centres, and we have the FEMI school where we really educate people. And that's one of the things we have to do. We have to educate a lot of our people, but it's generally the grassroots people who are picking up challenges also and taking on companies in the legal system. So you know, we just have to keep fighting no matter how hard it is. Laws and policies we were never involved in. And, you know, we were just like nobody, a lot of us Indigenous people. But it's through challenging that we're now becoming a voice. We're now becoming an identity where we now are getting some land rights. We are getting some of our rights as Indigenous people. You know, we've got to, you know, we may lose some battles, but I can tell you now we're winning some battles, and we just have to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And this is very much related to the next question. For instance, in recent times, we've seen two very distinct issues happening, or, you know, key things happening in the world. And one of it is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has forced people into isolation and social distancing and new sort of social norms that people are not used to. And the other one is the killing of George Floyd in the US, which you know, raised so much protests across the world against discrimination, incarceration of Black people, Indigenous people, etc. How does, you know, these two key events impact your work particularly? Is it a positive impact? Does it give you some kind of momentum into raising your voice on certain issues you've been working with? It will be interesting to hear from you panelists how these two key events actually impacted your work. Yes, Sandra.
Okay, so one of the things is that I think these two key things are coming together. Just from my own opinion, I think the George Floyd incident has really brought us together as a collective, and has really, it's not only Black Lives Matter, but it's Indigenous Lives Matter as well. And I think it's really brought our issues to the forefront, because no matter where you go in the world and you turning on the news or anything, there's Indigenous peoples marching along, you know, like for here, you know, and raising the issues of Indigenous Lives Matters and Black Lives Matters. And, you know, I think one of the things is, so the pandemic is on and we're in isolation, we're working more as a collective, and you know, we're really bringing out a lot more truth telling is what's happening, because what's happening is that people are at home now and they're more a bit isolated and watching the news and you know, really watching what's going on. Whereabouts before we lead busy lives, we're out doing sports and other things, so we don't have that time to sort of sit around and watch the news and do, you know, talk amongst ourselves. But I think with this happening, if you notice that people around the world, people of colour, are really talking about what has happened, the oppression that the unfairness and the injustice within the police force, the injustice within the coroner's investigations, and about the government's role when it comes to the indirect and direct discrimination for all of us. And it's a time, like I say, it's truth-telling. It's now time where Indigenous people are saying, well, this has actually happened to us as well. this has happened in this country, this has happened in that country. We all have the highest incarceration in the world, people of colour. And we know that jails in particular, you know, prisons, they're privately run and they make they're making a profit off by incarcerating us. And majority of us are in jail, in prisons for minor offences, sadly. And you know, and you'll find that Indigenous Black people in this world, Indigenous people, where it's very rare that you hear that we're serial killers and all of these, you know. So those long life sentences of people and death penalties, that really shouldn't be applying to us because we're here for a lot of the other minor offences. But for us, we're here telling people what's happened. We're talking about, you know what, we were under the Protection Act. We are still under a Protection Act. This is what's happened to us. You know, you see people pulling down statues around the world, and that's a good thing because those statues are put up by the old white men who wrote all our constitutions around the world, and that, you know, that are still in place. You know, it's our voices are rising, and again, it's truth telling. So to me, the pandemic, it's keeping people at home, but putting everybody on notice of truth telling for people of colour in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Any other panelists would like to chime in on this?
I think what I could say, Sandra has really talked quite a lot on in terms of the issue in the Black matters and so on. But what I would like to add is that the COVID-19 has also brought a lot of social changes, economic changes, and political changes within our own communities, within our Indigenous peoples. It has also changed their lives because, as you clearly had presented, is that you had put it, is that the Indigenous people are not used to be confined in one place. They are used to moving around and, you know, having that space to move around in. And that has made a lot of changes. And it has also brought a lot of other issues, like issues of conflict among the communities, among their own themselves, because of many other restrictions that have been there. There is also the fact that there are so many people locked down back home, which has taken a very long for that to happen, because most of the people are either somewhere else doing their own particular work. That one also brings a lot of impact. We've also realized that for women and girls, especially for Africa, we've been talking a lot on issues of gender-based violence. It has risen and it is really unbelievably going up, which we are so scared about. But what we have done as women, we even had a webinar yesterday to discuss about that. And what we just encourage the women is to make sure that we occupy ourselves and we try to get mechanism of reporting these cases to the government so that they can be able to take care and to come and try as much as possible. We even discussed the question of the culture of silence, because we know that many Indigenous communities, because of their remoteness and because of the fear that they don't want to go to report, and I'm sure that is also in Australia, the culture of silence is very dangerous, and we are trying to see how we can talk to the women, enhance their capacity so that they can have the voice to speak out. They should speak out but not be quiet. So these are some of the challenges that have been very dangerous out there. But at the same time, we have also seen, especially for us in Kenya, we've seen that the Indigenous women we have been working with have also gone another step ahead. They've been able to sit down in their communities and thrash out the problems that have been there, like, of course, the substance abuse, which is global, but it has become to the community a lot because people are idle. We've seen the women now increase their food security by making sure that at least they can plant more and try to make sure that the families are taken care of. So there's both negative and positive. But we have to take all those challenges and try to see how we can be able to manage them as time goes by.
Sheila, I don't know if you have, it would be nice to hear some insights from you how COVID-19 and also the killing of George Floyd and protests around the world have affected your work.
Yeah. we were impacted with what is happening. But we think that it's necessary to see and to take and pay attention what we can do or what we have to do. Because if we can see the context, we said we need to learn from this lesson how exacerbate in this time the racism in our society. And we don't need only to ask to others, we need to be included in that actions to eliminate the racism as ideology, as exercise through the power or decisions. In our case in the region, as you can imagine, the pendant agenda in public policy for indigenous peoples show us the necessity to be more strong and together making more pressure to the governors to put us in the agenda and in the distribution of economy, and principally building a new generation through the national system of education. We are talking about racism between us. We are talking about violence between us. But what happened with the decision makers? We need to have the power to decide and to say very clearly that we are here and we need to be respected and recognized in our full rights as peoples. It's not a problem of color. We need to recuperate the dimension of human being. All of us. In Peru, we have Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples and the diversities. For the third conference of racism and discrimination, we build a bridge between Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples against racism. That's why, for example, now we are trying to push one indigenous woman to occupy a place in the racism program in Mexico, for example. Because indigenous and diversities and Afro-descendants must be included in the policy. And we need our people too inside the power, inside the places where we decide the policies. Lucy and Sandra explained and said us many aspects similar in our places. And but we think it's very important to make advocacy or point recommendation for actions in the national system of education. We need a different content in the system of public education because white people, proper school, proper curricula, and the district too. People with money in there. And we, Black, poor, indigenous, and different diversities are not included in anywhere. We need to change that kind of mapa in our countries, in our society. We need to do that, yes, from international to local and vice versa. How are changing the situation in local when the politicians or presidents go to international fora and said, we will do, we are blah, 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 but nothing changed in our places. We need to do more strong movements.
Well, thank you very much, Tarsila. Actually, on the specific questions, there are a few questions directed to you, so I'll be able to engage you a little more on that. I'd like to ask a next question, and that is directed to Sandra, who's based in Australia, and from my understanding, it's actually very late. So Sandra, if you don't mind, you can answer this question, but you can also give your closing sort of remarks. And the question is, what specific strategies for Indigenous women that focus on sustainable development? What specific strategies, and this could be borrowed from some of the recommendations you made, what are some of those specific strategies for Indigenous women that focus on sustainable development? And this question is from Hamisi Mboga, who's based in Nairobi. Sandra?
Oh, sorry, I need to turn my mic on. I think one of the main strategies is that we need to go back and have a look at the sustainable development, because the recommendations that are in there under that are put forward for us, I think there's quite a few for Indigenous women to be, you know, under those sections. And I think one of the strategies that we need to actually do is to work in collaborations with people, but also to do a lot of research on what our rights are as human, as women and Indigenous women under the sustainable development, because like I said, you know, it states leave nobody behind, but yet we are being left behind, and yet we are the most, you know, we're the most vulnerable persons in the world. I think for Australia, one of the things is that we were supposed, the Australian government was to put in a report to the United Nations, and those reports, I think one of the things is, one of the strategies is looking at what the reports are that are going in from our governments to the United Nations. Then one of the other strategies is doing a shadow report regarding what our governments are not doing. I try and write shadow reports quite often when it came to Australia, and what their roles and their obligations are under the sustainable development, because, you know, one of the biggest issues here for us is water. And you know, and that is below the water below the ground, because a lot of our remote communities are using water below the ground. But I'll give you an example of what has happened here. Is that the water has been going for a long time, but about 5 months ago, a lady contacted me, and she lived on a community where they had bores in the ground. She had 10 bores. They only had one bore running. So that means that they're only able to get little access to the waters. So what we actually did was we done a short documentary and a film on it, and we've actually sent it around for everybody to view. And we wrote under that, we wrote with the short documentary, we actually wrote an article on sustainable development and our rights to that. And one of the things is that these women will then present that to the government, because sometimes doing showing pictures and films can be more powerful, and it can be for everybody to view. And I think, you know, we can write written statements, but we also need to put some sort of short documentary with those. And like I said, always look at when your country has to do shadow reports, and write to those, because, you know, it's 2020, sustainable development is 2030, you know, time's running out, and what has happened to us? We are being left behind. So we really need to get our act together, have a look at what reporting is what our government's reporting requirements are, and write anything against that and make them more accountable. And also, you know, go to other countries, have a look at you know, who are supporting Indigenous people, and ask them to have a look at and to support us in any of our documents to the United Nations when it comes to any interventions when we put that in, or also get as many people as you can to sign on to any documents that you write, and to have that support to show and to raise that awareness, but also to show as a collective what our issues are and what how we are being left behind. I'm sorry it's so late here. I'm going to sleep. But one of the closing comments that I'd like to say is that, you know, thank you very much. At this time, this webinar is really needed, especially to some of the issues that have been touched on here tonight by Jaslika, by Anne, and by Lucy, and also to raise awareness of us as a collective, but also that we are Indigenous women and we do have a rights. We have a right to access health, we have a right to our land, and we have a right to have our voices heard. And also it's about you know, some of the issues that are happening, you know, the domestic violence, the rise of domestic violence, the issues of incarceration. You know, it's very difficult, but, you know, by working as a collective, being a collective, and hearing the voices from Lucy and Jaslika, who are very well experienced, and taking note of what their recommendations are, and reaching out even to other women like themselves who can empower, and, you know, to empower and to support, because, you know, we all know knowledge is power. And by doing this and by having this in, especially like Anne, Jaslika and Lucy, who are very well experienced and have a lot of wisdom, to do this tonight, and for them to be able to share that knowledge and empower, and it empowers everybody, I'm sure, who's listening on here. And it has really empowered me, and it's reminded me of what I need to keep talking about as well. So to all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. We deeply appreciate your participation and your acceptance to be part of this webinar. And we'll definitely be in touch with you, especially on the questions that may have been pushed to you directly for further insights. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Declan, may I say, oh, she's left.
No.
Hi, I just wanted to add my words of appreciation to you, Sandra. I know it is very, very late, must be midnight by now, or after midnight, way after midnight. So we really, truly appreciate that you shared your voice with us, because as you said, it's very important, and your words of wisdom, and we are there to support you in any way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Declan, back to you.
Oh, great. Yeah, so we do have a few more questions left, 2-3 questions. And these are more specific in nature to both Sheila, and I'll also ask Lucy, who's with us still. So this question is from Rana from Hawaii, and Rana is asking Sheila a very specific question. The question is, there are almost 500 languages among the indigenous people of South America. How does this impact on your fight for justice and equality? Sheila?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Rana. It's not easy because many of indigenous peoples are in communities very far from the official issues. And for example, in Peru, we Quechuas and Aymaras, I can say, because the consequence of colonization, we struggle historically against colonizers. In the time of colonization or invasion and after, in the constitution of republics. But many of other peoples, like our sisters and brothers from the Amazon, they had some kind of good luck because they were not colonized like the Andes, but they suffered the evangelization from evangelio, missionaries, and they tried to access to Spanish and Catholic religion. But the difference is many of peoples and cultures who still now are far from the cities, they are living in isolated condition. For some aspects is good, but for other aspects is bad. Because during these decades, we thought as indigenous activists from 70s, what we want. We are part of the state or we are against the states. During the elaboration of the declaration, the UNDRIP, we discussed many years about the concept of self-determination. And it's very, very complex, but it's very difficult because, for example, in Peru, the government said, we can't do a curriculum, a specific curriculum for 20 families because we have some specific cultures, language, and place with 20 families. But now, as you know, we have many support as international policy from UNESCO because each culture, each language is a reach of the world. It's not important if they are 5 families, 1 family, or 20 families, or 100 families. That's the I don't know, the instrument that we use to be sure between us about our rights and try to teach to others that we have rights. It's not easy because the racism, for example, many people who suffer colonization, evangelization, ideologization, politicization. It's very difficult to recuperate the proper right because the society make pressure historically that we are not equal to others. That's our problem. That's why we talk about racism as ideology, because pushing this kind of bad concept with us, finally maybe we think, oh yes, I am not equal. No, we need to work very hard about our rights when we looking for fun, for example, to make training about self-esteem, about cultural identity, many times they said, no, you are doing training, but we need, because the power of us is to be sure that we have rights, we have subject of rights, and we need to teach to others to the same, and not we don't want to be looked from others only as a folklore, also only dance, music. We need to see from others like politics subject with rights. That's our consigna when we talk between us, but I know many of us over the world are trying to do the best to change the invisibility and exclusion.
Thank you very much, Tashila. I think you've actually, tackled two additional questions in from someone in Geneva on Aymara communities and why they're against the teaching of their language in schools, because that's a source of discrimination, as well as the question of policies in government. I think the next question is actually the final question, and it was asked, it was directed to Anne, who's not here, but I'd like to direct this question to Lucy. And the question is, can you expound on the measures put in place to protect Indigenous women?
So I hope you'll be able to hear me, because the internet is going down and I don't know why. But one thing that I want just to pick up from what Tarsila has talked about, and she has very clearly put it, that we have to keep on, building a capacity of our Indigenous women, our Indigenous people. We have to keep on making that noise so that we can be able to protect them. And indeed, we have the International Indigenous Forum, Indigenous Women Forum. That is one of the forum that has continued to try and see how we protect Indigenous women and girls. And we have been having different activities in different regions. We are also very lucky that particular forum has been funded funding from different donors, and especially one that comes from the Netherlands, the government of the Netherlands. And this has really helped us in terms of reaching out to different rural women from anywhere. They've been able to get funding and be able to have their own activities. That means that we are trying as much as possible to make sure that we reconnect with them. They are able to go back and look at their language. We have also some donors who have been funding them in terms of looking at issues of language. We have issues of training the Indigenous women on their rights, because we have to keep on making that noise. We have to make them to know who they are and why they should be there, and then they have a right, and they should not be silent by anything. They have to keep on going. So we have activities that are going on, and we have those networks that I had mentioned earlier in my presentation. We have the webinar, we have the WhatsApp, and we are also working very closely with the other Indigenous women from the other parts of the world. Tarsila, we've worked with Tarsila since, I think, 98 or even earlier, 95, since Beijing and all that process. And we have been working together and sharing this information. Same to others from Asia and so on, because we want to keep this history. We don't, as Sandra has said, we don't want it to be like, this is the past. No, we have to continue working and making sure that we protect Indigenous women and make sure that they also come, as they have already, that their own self-determination, they have to come up with that voice of themselves. And that's why we are even doing this arrangement and this networking, to make sure that the young also learn from the old, so that the legacy continues, their identity continue, their visibility continue. So we have to continue this process no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I think that is a powerful closure to our Q&A session. And I'd like to thank you for being great. I'd like to hand it back to Dr. Sheila to give further guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Declan. As you said, that was a very powerful closure to the Q&A, but I know time is not on our side. So I would just like us to end, but I would like to give Jaslika and Lucy, first Jaslika, 1 minute to make her very final statement, and then followed by Lucy.
Okay, thank you.
Jaslika, you're muted.
Now?
Yes, now it's okay. Yes, it's okay if you can speak up a bit louder.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity, because we are globalizing our concerns, but our actions and vision to change the situation. That's very important. And the people who are listening us, please, something is something. Maybe one or two are trying to add to our movement and try to disseminate the information. And we need to use in better way these instruments of communication. And after maybe some national organizations can send to rural area or to share with grassroots organizations too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaslika. Lucy?
Yes, I just want to say that a human rights-based approach is very important for development, because that one will ensure that no one is left behind. Even if it's a matter of development issues like information, as we have said, reaching out, health, and all other facilities like water and so on, and food and everything. We really need to use a human rights approach, especially at this time when we have the COVID. And I thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shall still be reaching out to all of you, because there are questions that we have not been able to cover. The questions from Australia, from Geneva, from Pakistan, and from Kenya and other places. So we shall reach out to you with those questions. And we do make a commitment to disseminate the information that you have shared with us, the awareness that you raised in us, that all of us can play a role to support justice and development of indigenous peoples, because injustice against even one single person is an injustice for all. So I would like to end with by saying that indigenous rights are human rights. Please let us not only listen, but take actions in our own way on how we can support and help to address these injustices. So thank you once again for everything. And for all our other viewers, I would really like to thank you for your patience. I know some of you are tuning in all the way from Australia, where it's now far beyond midnight. And Jaslika woke up very early to join us. But I would like you to stay with us after this webinar, because we have a series of other webinars. We have webinars every last Wednesday of the month, and expert interviews and youth conversations in between. So on Friday, 11 o'clock, you can tune in for an expert interview on girls' education. I don't want to keep you anymore, but thank you ever so much. And we shall also reach out to you also for expert interviews. So thanks to all our viewers, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Good to see your face.
Bye.